Afternoon. My name is Val Rynnimeri. I'm a colleague of Philip's at the School of Architecture, and I'm not going to be talking about my work. If I was to talk about my work, it would be as an urban designer, an ecological designer. The stuff that I do is mostly about designing ecosystems and to do that in a kind of open-ended way that operates through complex systems. At any rate, what I am going to talk about is an old professor of mine, Jekabs, Zvilna, who was my first year professor. He was an enormous influence in the architecture school at Waterloo, and he was a pioneer in what we do, but a very different kind of pioneer. So I'm going to actually step back a bit, because what I've seen actually over the last couple of days is a really remarkable and really important desire to engage in the world. One could not say that about Jekabs. Jekabs was a solitary person sitting in a room working on this kind of stuff alone with no computers. So what you have, in a sense, is somebody who's not just a pioneer, let's say at a place like MIT, but is a pioneer in the sense of trying to understand what all of this means at a level of revelation. This is Jekabs up in the top corner. I think if you popped a beret on Philip's head and put some his little dark frame glasses on him, Philip could stand in for Jekabs. Sorry, Philip. You could. But the beret would look good on you, a kind of rakish figure. So, but Jekabs wrote 3 papers, and he did 2 large bodies of work. One, which is graphic and 2-dimensional, and the other is 3-dimensional. This is a kind of tough screen. From one of his really key articles, Ad Infinitum, which he wrote in 1989, and it actually summarizes pretty much the research. So I've been drawing a lot from it, but there are 2 other previous works which talk about geometry and which talk about the kind of work through processes. But what you have to see about Jekabs is that in his biography, you just don't expect it. You see that, he designed toys and games. He studied architecture in Latvia. The war interfered. He came to in the early 50s, and he essentially made a living made toys and games, as he puts it. These are his words. In the 1950s, he went back to architecture, but in this kind of research, which actually is a kind of precursor to what all of us are doing to some degree or other. In the 1970s, though, he taught at the architecture school for about 10 to 15 years, and his influence was profound, and most of the students of that generation, because they went through the first year with Jekabs, they still hold that in their making of architecture. The other thing with Jekabs that's interesting is that, and in that first year studio, is that you didn't do buildings. You instead worked with form generation, with understanding the kind of creation of form as a kind of process, not as a kind of goal to make a building, but just as a kind of process in itself. And that habit, with myself, with all of my other colleagues, my peers at my age, still is deeply, deeply persistent. And you'll see that in the work of one of the students. Jekabs' vocabulary, this is his glossary. At the beginning of his article, he has to put in a glossary because the language is so strange. So he says, this is what I mean by all of these things. He even separates nature into nature's order, nature plus man, our connection to nature, but also what he's really interested in, which is nature's order, not natural order, but nature's order, and an order that hasn't been decoded as yet. And that is his life's purpose, is to decode that, and to decode it at a very kind of personal level, because what he's trying to do is to understand, to find out what truth is, to go back to field time or space-time, to the source, and return step by step with memories inscribed in mind or matter all the way up to the present. So there's this kind of play with memory as well. One of his one of his memes was Homo ludens from Huizinga, the person who plays. And this is very important in understanding form in Jekabs' universe, is that form is an engagement with play. If you see, the top two paragraphs in that extract are what he's doing graphically in what he called field time, which is working with these very, very small graphic plates with carbon black in them, and then inserting thinners and chemicals in them, and then starting to manipulate the plates. These are small, right? As he says himself, not worth looking at. But then he blows them up to huge size at the various stages of manipulation, and in effect creates these kinds of enormous graphics that then would be about the size of, let's say, a door, a room, and they in effect were a kind of frozen form of a process. And this is actually a sequence of those forms. If I go back, what he's looking at is he's saying he's not the creator here. What it is a dance between him and the materials, him and the form, him and the process. And in that dance, is surprise, there is recognition, there are all those factors that in effect will reveal this kind of sense of truth to him. This is the end result. There's a lot of them are spirals, a lot of them are kind of centrally focused, and this is in effect the end result. This is a photograph, a super graphic. It's the late 60s, mid 60s. So these were all over the School of Architecture, and they in effect became a kind of constant reminder of the importance of form and how form is generated. These are my favorites, personally. These are the kind of two-dimensional, the manifolds, the two-dimensional surfaces. This is not a 3D model. This is actually a manipulation of 2D form, and then I think these are done on a kind of incline. So he's actually working with those, by pressure on the glass, by pulling it up, by slight rotations, by jiggling a bit. There's this kind of interaction between this very small system and the person. Let's see, where am I time-wise? I'm not going to go on. Okay. What Jekabs did next is what we affectionately called in the school the Zvilna blocks, and these were the things that he handed to students. But this was also a personal research for him. Zvilna blocks were an attempt to create a kind of module that would illustrate his principles, the principles of translation and rotation in 3 dimensions, and then become the formulation for a hierarchic system of building bigger and bigger structures. And you see the beginnings of those kinds of manipulations in this thing from his article. And this is the kind of framework behind it. There's this interesting language. It's a language which is highly mathematical, highly kind of process-driven. There's kind of redundances of Buckminster Fuller in it. But what's interesting is that it's all about revelation. It's all about trying to understand what the kind of translations, the rotations are telling him about how nature understands itself and how nature can communicate that sensibility to him. And this is the kind of result done by him. Also, the place was full because 60 students doing these things over 10 years. This thing is fantastic. And you can see that there's creations of solids, creations of spaces, and then there's a sense of also two-dimensional surfaces and manifolds. And these are the kind of beginnings of structure, but it's all done from one module subject to kind of multiple rotations. These things he was invited in the 1960s to 2 exhibitions. It was his annus mirabilis a bit. One exhibition at MIT, arranged by Georgi Kepish, and then another one also arranged by Kepish at Harvard School of Design. And later on, one of the research assistants that he thanks is Alison Brooks. And I mention Alison Brooks because she's probably the most the most famous graduate of the architecture school, and she was his research assistant. And you can see that in her work. You can see the kind of very careful translations and rotations and motions and subtractions in the kind of geometry of her work in what is otherwise a very normal housing typology. So she is an architect, unapologetically. Doesn't want to be somebody who's following in Jekabs' research, but you can see the deep influence in her work. This is the second last slide. And I just put this up because I want you to understand what he's reading at the same time, because that's part of what the kind of research that I'll be working on for LASIG will be pulling forth. You can see this is a very impressive list, and he was a polymath. He read through all of this. What's not included on here are extensive readings in Zen, Sufism, and in kind of revelatory spirituality as well. He was looking for what was at the heart of creation. And the last phrase, I'll leave it up to Jekabs. Both developments in field time and space time are self-organizing systems. My own role has been that of a midwife, coating the glass sheets, the field, with a carbon black in which the patterns are revealed, cutting the various building blocks, not digital, out of styrofoam or wood, accepting the emergence by chance of the code A, B, C, D, and painting the elements in 4 different tones, then guided by the ultimate restraint, one structure, only one method of connection, and one type of element, I let the form emerge. And what's all this for? To be surprised, to be able to wonder. And I'll leave that. Thank you. A bit different.
May I say that this is work that's been presented for the very first time here, and in addition to his wonder, it is a revelation. There is time for questions.
Very quick, anyway. Okay. Sitting in a room. Okay. Sitting in a room quietly, playing. Homo ludens. That's who we all are too, don't forget.
Thank you for the inspiring talk. I think the main lesson that at least I'm taking away from the work and from your description of it is the essential power of restraint. And I'm wondering, in the context of this symposium, which is just it's an incredible range and diversity of approaches and methods and ways of thinking and ways of working, different types of labs, different, paper space, model space, and 4-dimensional space, living space too. I guess I'm wondering what your view is of that lesson of restraint within the context of the work that we're seeing here, because it seems like every presentation is a lesson for other presentations, so it's an interesting, I think, view.
As somebody mentioned, we're really at the beginning here. I mean, Jekabs' family is up there, 2 granddaughters, a daughter, 2 granddaughters and a daughter, and one of the granddaughters, who's an artist herself, said her grandfather would have not come out of the room had he been given one of these. So I think what's interesting with Jekabs is that restraint was important for him because it was his discipline. It was his personal path to find out this kind of truth. I think that he could communicate it to students was not that he was trying to make us little Jekabs, but I think what he wanted all of us to do was somehow find that similar kind of restraint, to be able to understand what are the boundaries of your form making and what's the advantage of having that restraint. But also I think what's very important, and this is in my work, in ecosystem, is to really value surprise and to notice it, to have your ear there to hear it, to see it, and to smell it, and to kind of say, something is happening here that I didn't expect, and I'm certainly not going to, crush it. And so I think that's the big lesson that I think all of us learned as architects or as researchers or whatever.